All right. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 23 today, and this is the story of David and Keilah. We'll start at verse 1. It reads, "Now they told David, 'Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors.'" And we can see where Keilah is right here. And we remember that David has gone, he was hiding at the cave of Adullam for a little while. He was hiding over here in the forest of Hereth for a little while. We'll see him bouncing around a little bit more, but we're talking about this area right here. Verse 2, "Therefore David inquired of the Lord, 'Shall I go and attack these Philistines?' And the Lord said to David, 'Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah.'" We might notice something already in that Saul's big complaint is that the Lord stopped answering him. He wouldn't talk to him. And we see that David is not having that issue. What we also assume is that since Abiathar has escaped Saul and has gone to David, and we'll find out later that he escaped with the high priest garments, which would have had the Urim and Thummim in them. And it's likely that David is using those to inquire of the Lord in this situation. Verse 3 says, "But David's men said to him, 'Behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines?'" Right? So they're afraid of their own deranged king and small army, and they're even more afraid of a competent king. This would be the ruler of the Philistines, and their very competent army. So the men are understandably afraid. Verse 4, "Then David inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord answered him, 'Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand.'" So the men hear this second acknowledgement that everything's good, go down there, defend that city. Once they get that second acknowledgement, they're ready to go. Verse 5, "And David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their livestock and struck them with a great blow. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah." Okay, so to kind of keep up with where we're at, Keilah is right over here. It's just, what is it, southwest of Jerusalem, not very far. And that's where the Philistines are attacking. So David and his men, they go defend that city, right? So verse 6, "When Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, had fled to David to Keilah, he had come down with an ephod in his hand. Now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah. And Saul said, 'God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars.'" Let's start with that part first. Saul is so delusional at this point that he thinks that God is actually trapping David for him. He's not, but Saul believes that. Now, how did Saul find out that David was in Keilah? If we remember, what happened to Ahimelech to begin with was when David went and saw him at Nob, nobody told Saul because nobody figured there was a reason to. Everything seemed fine, as it seems. But nobody told him, and that's why Saul killed all the priests and all the families and everybody down there. It's likely that the people of Keilah, I mean, they obviously heard about it, but in order to avoid that situation to themselves, they may have went ahead and told Saul that David was there to get ahead of the situation. We'll get more into that as it moves on. And Saul, verse 8, "And Saul summoned all the people to war." So the Israelites, he's the king of Israel. He has summoned all of the soldiers to go to war. Against the Philistines? No. Against the Amalekites? No. Against David. And Saul summoned all the people to war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. Verse 9, "David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, 'Bring the ephod here.' Then David said, 'O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard, O Lord, the God of Israel? Please tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. Right? There's no question. Right? David said, will Saul come down? And God said, yes. Then David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you. So God told David, Saul will come down. They will surrender him into his hand. But neither one of those things happen because David leaves. Now, was God wrong? Obviously not. So what do we do with that? This is a very good proof that God knows everything possible and real, right? So this situation never happens because David didn't stay there for it to happen. But God knew that if he did stay, that it would happen. So we understand that God knows everything, but do we truly understand that he also knows everything possible? Any variation of anything, he already knows. That's something to keep in mind. Verse 13, then David and his men, who were about 600, so he's gained a couple hundred. I think it was 400 before. So he's gained some men. David and his men, who were about 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition. So, to be clear, this city was being invaded by the Philistines. David defended the city. David and his men defended the city, and the thanks that they got were the people of the city told Saul so that Saul was going to come kill David, who just provided salvation for this city through the hand of God. Verse 14, and David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. And we can see that on our map right over here, a little bit southeast of Keilah. We have Ziph in the wilderness right out here. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hand. Saul sought David every day. Saul is forgetting who the enemy is, and it's not David. Verse 15, David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh, and Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. So even though Saul is still hunting to kill David, Jonathan, it seems like, knew exactly where he was and went there not to hunt him, but to strengthen him in God, it says. Verse 17, and he said to him, do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Well, Jonathan's right about a couple things. The hand of Saul will not find David, not to kill him. David will be king over Israel. That's correct. But as much as Jonathan wants to be next to him and support him in that role, Jonathan's not going to be there. Unfortunately, he's going to fall under the judgment due to Saul. Verse 18, and the two of them made a covenant before the Lord, and David remained at Horesh, and Jonathan went home. And that's the last time that those two will be together. Sad as it is. Verse 19, then the Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah, saying, is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horesh on the hill of Hakilah, which is south of Jeshimon? So now David's hiding in the wilderness of Ziph because the people of Keilah betrayed him and told Saul that he was there. So he runs to Ziph, and now the people of there are running and telling Saul that he's there. So it seems like everybody's heard about what happened at Nob, and they're all trying to get ahead of it and avoid it. So Saul's tactic, it would seem, is working, but God is keeping David one step ahead regardless. Verse 20, now come down, O king, according to all your heart's desire to come down, and our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand. And Saul said, may you be blessed by Yahweh, for you have had compassion on me. So that's ironic. guess I'll just leave that at that. Verse 22, even though Saul is appreciative of getting this information, he doesn't fully trust it because he knows how sneaky David is. So verse 22, Saul tells the guy, "Go and make yet more sure, know and see the place where his foot is, and who has seen him there. For it is told me that he is very cunning. See therefore and take note of all the lurking places where he hides, and come back to me with sure information. Then I will go with you. And if he is in the land, I will search him out among all the thousands of Judah." And they arose and went to Ziph ahead of Saul. So David's in trouble, right? He's on the run again. He just keeps getting betrayed. These people that he's familiar with, that he's bonded with, that should be under the same covenant that he's under, these people that he does nothing wrong up to this point against, they keep betraying him. He served Saul faithfully. He helped Keilah. He went to Ziph. There's no issues, but everybody's still. You ever feel that way? You ever feel like you're constantly trying to help people, and they just, they spit in your face about it. They'll take your help, but there's not that we need appreciation for it. It's nice, but we don't need it. But what we don't expect for helping people is to get stabbed in the back for our efforts, and that does happen sometimes. And I guess one thing we can take away from it is we can react the way that David reacts. Instead of going back at Saul or going back at Keilah or Ziph, he relies on God to get him through those situations. And that's a good lesson for us. Now, David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon. Let's find that. That's over here, just south of Ziph. So David keeps getting run further and further south at this point. In the Arabah to the south of Jeshimon. And Saul and his men went to seek him. And David was told, so he went down to the rock and lived in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men are on the other side of the mountain. So we can see they're circling it here, almost like a cartoon. I'm sure it wasn't to David. Keep in mind that even though David trusted God wholeheartedly, he was still in fear for his life. As he said, he knew that he was one step away from death always. So he's scared. This is not a fun time for King David. They're on one side, David and his men are on the other side, and David was hurrying to get away from Saul. As Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them, a messenger came to Saul. Now, here's a couple interesting things. If we back up just a second here, and it says up here in verse 24 that David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon. In verse 25, Saul and his men went to seek him, and David was told. It doesn't tell us who told David, just that David was told. So just like Saul, through his bloodlust tyranny, has gotten people that are willing to give him information, like Keilah telling him that David's there, or the guys in Ziph telling Saul that David's there. Well, David might have some informants too, and they're not named, and we don't know where they came from, kind of. But we do know that God was answering David's prayers, and he was keeping him safe. So it would seem that these people that are coming to help and warn David and let him know that danger's on the way, this is not an accident. It's not a coincidence. The Lord's helping David. And we see that again in verse 27, where it says a messenger came to Saul. So again, we don't know who that was or where they came from, but it seems like they were sent there by the Lord, basically, to help David, because Saul is bearing down on David, catching up with him. And remember, he has a big army, a lot bigger than David's army. And just it seems when he's getting close enough that he can finally taste it, this messenger shows up and says, "Hey, There's a Philistines attack happening right now. So verse 27, a messenger came to Saul saying, hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land. So Saul returned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines. Therefore, that place was called the Rock of Escape. And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. And we can see that on our map. It's over here on the western coast of the Dead Sea. So throughout this, Saul has forgotten who the enemy is. A messenger came and reminded him, hey, the Philistines are attacking the land. You know, what are you going to be king of if the Philistines just take everything while you're chasing around your former right-hand man? So he's reminded by this messenger, the Philistines are the enemy. David never forgot. David knew that the Philistines were the enemy, and he knew that Saul was not. So in David's heart, Saul was never his enemy. But in Saul's heart, David was the main enemy. Why? Why was David the main enemy when the Philistines are right there? Because he's the one trying to take what's mine. You know, Saul's wanting to hold on to that kingdom so hard. He wants to hold on to that spear and that pride, and he wants to hold on to the kingdom, and he wants everybody to look at him, acknowledge him. He's the king, right? And all of that, he forgets who the enemy is. We're to serve the Lord, and the enemy is the enemies of the Lord. David, a man after God's heart, is not the enemy of the Lord. He is trying to, at this point, it seems like he's not even trying to reconcile with Saul anymore. He won't attack him, but he's given up on the idea of them being, things going back the way they were, of them living together and sharing, David being there by his side. These things aren't going to happen again. David knows that. But he still never made Saul his enemy. Saul kept David his enemy his entire life. So what we can take out of chapter 23 here in 1 Samuel is we need to know who our enemies are and who they're not. Somebody, just because they're attacking you and just because they're mistreating you, and even if you haven't done anything wrong, that person's not your enemy, right? The motivations behind that can be, but that person's not your enemy. That's another person made in the image of God. We need to do what David did and rely on the Lord, rely on his strength to get us through tough situations, tough times. And we need to always rest in the fact that no matter what happens, it's all going according to plan, right? These are the plans that were set in place before the foundations of the world. We have Jesus that we can always rely on and lean back on, that, hey, if everything's not going right, and maybe Saul does catch David at some point, right? And that can be in his mind. He doesn't, but it could be in his mind. Maybe he does catch me and maybe he kills me. I'm still okay, right? I'll go to be with the Lord. I'll be in the hands of God. And, things, the lowest level of happiness with the Lord is so much further above the highest level of happiness that we can think of right now. So David is aware of it. We need to be aware of it. So I hope that blessed somebody today. Thanks for watching.